Okay, the topic of this paper is the relationship between literature, health and illness, as theorized in the work of French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. This is a topic I've been researching for a long time now, perhaps too long. My first encounter with Deleuze was when I was an MA student in Dublin back in 2005. And it was through his book on the 19th century novelist Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, who's mostly known today for being the origin of the term masochism, and interestingly, he's the great-great-uncle of Marianne Faithfull. Bit of trivia for you. Masoch, along with Marquis de Sade, feature as exemplary figures in Krafft-Ebing's notorious Encyclopedia of Sexual Perversions, Psychopathia Sexualis. Deleuze notes that both Masoch and Sade are literary authors who've given their names to clinical diagnoses. He does so not, as we might expect, in order to condemn the reactionary Victorian practice of medicalizing sexuality, but to reinterpret the role of pathology in the semiotics of literature. He observes that great clinicians are the greatest doctors. When a doctor gives his name to an illness, this is a major linguistic and semiological step, inasmuch as a proper name is linked to a group of signs. That is, a proper name is made to connote signs. Deleuze contends that authors are clinicians in precisely this sense. The symptoms of physiological and psychological ordeal are the raw materials out of which the writer creates his or her work. In other words, writers do not need a Krafft-Ebing or even a Freud to come along and diagnose them. Their work, to the extent that it constitutes a semiotic transformation of symptoms, is the diagnosis. As Deleuze remarks, it is not the complex which provides us with information about Oedipus and Hamlet, but rather Oedipus and Hamlet who provide us with information about the complex. For this reason, Deleuze insists that authors are both doctors and patients at once, the subjects and objects of a transformative diagnosis that bears upon their individual and collective existence. He writes in this sense that Sade and Masoch are great anthropologists of the type whose work succeeds in embracing a whole conception of man, culture and nature, as well as great artists in that they discovered new forms of expression, new ways of thinking and feeling, and an entirely original language. This transformative power of literature as a collective self-diagnosis and cultural renewal is what Deleuze called critique et clinique, the critical and the clinical, or what I call simply the literary clinic. Through a creative self-diagnosis or symptomatology, the author extracts from his or her own suffering new and revitalizing ways of living and speaking at odds with the conventions of his or her socio-historical context. In this sense, the body of the author is itself a kind of symptom or anomaly, manifesting in an almost messianic way a form of health to come. When I first came across the concept of the literary clinic as an MA student, I was convinced that it would have been comprehensively covered in the then burgeoning secondary literature on Deleuze. But to my surprise, practically nothing had been written on it, and it was then that I had my light bulb moment and realised exactly what my PhD had to be on. I soon set about writing what I hoped would be the definitive book on Deleuze's literary clinic, and 8 years later, here it is. What I'm going to present here tonight, however, is far less a summary.
It's on the latch. Yeah, it's on the latch of the program.
In other words, clinic and application, absolutely.
Can you push it off the latch, Jess?
So what I'm going to present here tonight, however, is far less a summary of this book than a reinterpretation of the research that went into it. As Deleuze himself suggested, every book is double. There's the book that we long to write, written in blood, and then there's the book we actually end up writing. So this presentation bears more resemblance to the former than to the latter. It's a characteristic of Deleuze's work generally that he rarely gives us an insight into something without also telling us about some other, apparently unrelated thing. Deleuze loved to create unlikely pairings. His favourite word was and, or a. For him, nothing interesting ever happens except through a conjunction, a coupling, what he called a double becoming. And the stranger, more unnatural, more counterintuitive the coupling, the better. This is evident from the titles of his books alone. subjectivity and empiricism, difference and repetition, capitalism and schizophrenia, critical and clinical. The conjunction of the critical and the clinical denotes the link between literature and health, literary form and embodied life that fascinated Deleuze for most of his career. He stated in a late interview that he had long dreamed of writing a series of studies on literary authors under the title Critical and Clinical, and indeed his final book bears this title. In the preface to that work, he makes the enigmatic assertion that, quote, literature is an enterprise of health. By this he does not mean that authors generally have a good or robust health. On the contrary, he insists upon the curious propensity of great authors to suffer from a weak constitution and a tenuous personal life. He cites the alcoholism of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Malcolm Lowry, Woolf's anorexia, the tuberculosis of D.H. Lawrence and Kafka, the schizophrenia of Hölderlin and Artaud, William Burroughs' drug addiction. Deleuze is not primarily making a biographical, psychological or socio-historical point here, but what we might perhaps call a bioaesthetic one. The central hypothesis of the literary clinic is that authors tend to suffer a weak health, not because of any deficiency or privation of life, but on the contrary because of an excess, an overabundance of life, a sensibility so strong that it damages the physical and psychological integrity of the self. The literary clinic revolves around an encounter with a force in excess of all conventional modes of living, feeling and speaking. As Deleuze puts it in one particularly evocative formulation, the writer returns from what he has seen and heard with bloodshot eyes and pierced eardrums. He thus argues that authors have a special relationship with physical, psychological and spiritual ordeal, and that this grants them an insight into the peculiar practice of literary creativity. This idea is not unique to Deleuze, of course, and writers themselves have frequently meditated on the special relationship between ill health and the peculiar nature of their industry. Robert Louis Stevenson, for example, once observed that, quote, "For 14 years I have not had a day's real health. I have awakened sick and gone to bed weary, and I have done my work unflinchingly. I have written in bed and written out of it, written in hemorrhages, written in sickness, written torn by coughing. The powers have so willed that my battlefield should be this dingy, inglorious one of the bed and the physic bottle." Virginia Woolf, in her essay on Being Ill, argues that illness should have long ago taken its place alongside war and love as one of the great preoccupations of literary authors. She suggests that illness brings us up against the very limits of language, and that these limits allow for a loosening of the constraints of linguistic convention. She writes that, quote, "English, which can express the thoughts of Hamlet and the tragedy of Lear, has no words for the shiver and the headache. The merest schoolgirl, when she falls in love, has Shakespeare or Keats to speak her mind for her, but let a sufferer try to describe a pain in his head to a doctor, and language at once runs dry. There is nothing ready-made for him. He is forced to coin words himself, and, taking his pain in one hand and a lump of pure sound in the other, so to crush them together that a brand new word drops out." It is this incorrigible presence of the inarticulate in suffering, that lump of pure sound coagulated around a trauma, that forms the germ of all literary creativity. Literature then would not be primarily a textual or linguistic concern, but rather a product of that borderline where linguistic meaning dissolves into paralinguistic expression. The cough, the breath, the sigh, the howl, the clicking of the throat, the stutter, and not the formulations of articulate speech constitute the proper semiotic of literary language. This perhaps brings Deleuze close to T.S. Eliot's observation that poetry is like a raid on the inarticulate. But where Eliot laments the waning of the power of expression amidst what he saw as the general mess of imprecision of feeling and undisciplined squads of emotion, Deleuze asserts that the failure of articulacy marks the very entry of life into language. In his very last piece of writing, composed while he was himself suffering the final throes of a terminal illness, Deleuze draws upon a literary source to help clarify what he means by that enigmatic word life, which crops up so frequently in his work. Invoking the character of Rogue Rider Hood from Dickens' Our Mutual Friend, Deleuze writes, quote, a disreputable man, a rogue, held in contempt by everyone, is found as he lies dying. Suddenly, those taking care of him manifest an eagerness, respect, even love for his slightest sign of life. Everyone bustles about to save him, to the point where, in his deepest coma, this wicked man himself senses something soft and sweet penetrating him. But to the point where he comes back to life, his saviours turn colder, and he becomes once again mean and crude. Between his life and his death, there is a moment that is only that of a life, playing with death. End quote. It is this manifestation of life, momentarily flaring up from a damaged, suffering or impaired body, that forms the basis of Deleuze's particular brand of vitalism. In the philosophical discourse of vitalism that goes back to Aristotle, life is characterized as the elusive, quasi-spiritual force that remains fundamentally irreducible to the mechanistic view of the living being. The case for the irreducibility of life to mere physical mechanism was made, perhaps most strongly, by the philosopher Henri Bergson, whose concept of élan vital and vital impetus, or vital impetus as it was translated, attained great notoriety in the early 20th century as an explanation of the creative change manifest in evolution. For Bergson, the organism is not a totality existing within a greater totality of the wider universe, but a partial view of the creative genesis of the universe as a whole. The organism is fundamentally open to the world about it, and this openness is the ontological ground, the plane on which all beings meet and intermingle in a process of self-engendering self-creativity. The spiritual overtones of Bergson's work are counteracted by Deleuze's emphasis on the materialism of the encounter, by which this fundamental openness is realized or actualized as an element of our embodied experience. The encounter with the open can only be materialized through a traumatic crack in our physical and psychological integrity. And this explains the cover. Deleuze's all-time favourite line in literature is the opening sentence of F. Scott Fitzgerald's essay, The Crack-Up. Of course, all life is a process of breaking down. What the of course here signifies is that every manifestation of life involves a kind of vital malfunction through which the signs of life are made known to us. Of course we get sick, of course we die. How otherwise would we know we were living? How else could life take on a semiotic value, a significance? Without such vital self-demolition, life would never signify or mean anything. It would never take on the differences that render it important. Meaning only becomes material or embodied through the crack that opens us up to the world. This is what joins Deleuze's bio-philosophy to his aesthetics. He observes that there's a profound, quote, there's a profound link between science, life and vitalism. The power of non-organic life that can be found in a line that's drawn, a line of writing, a line of music. It's organisms that die, not life. And any work of art points a way through for life, finds a way through the cracks. This amounts to what I call a kind of traumatic semiotics of creative practices. Art points a way for life, but only through the cracks that pierce the functional unity of the organism and undermine the subjective integration of the self. The artistic impulse opens us up with a shock or a trauma by which the organic and socio-linguistic determinations of subjectivity are partially suspended. The writer returns from this experience, like Burroughs from Interzone, with the mark of death upon him. The implications of this bioaesthetic paradigm go beyond the domain of art towards a whole politics of embodiment. The organism, as Deleuze understands it, is a concept that extends far beyond the purely biological sphere. It refers to any organization of elements stipulating a particular kind of functioning and prohibiting others. The organism is the limitation imposed on any kind of activity by a higher order of unity. It is synonymous with the judgment of God, the death sentence that comes from on high, to inscribe the relationships determining part and whole, microcosm and macrocosm, species and genus. This is why I argue that the literary clinic has a political and materialist basis. Deleuze's emphasis on what he calls non-organic life denotes a kind of biopolitical struggle and a whole revolutionary physiology. Artaud's remarkable radio play, To Have Done with the Judgment of God, is the battle hymn of this revolutionary war. As Artaud writes, "Man is sick because he is badly constructed. we must make up our minds to strip him bare in order to scrape off that animalcule that itches him mortally. God, and with God, his organs. For you can tie me